I've spoken in general terms about some ethical considerations before, but practically speaking, what does that actually translate to? Here's a list of concrete best practices that you might want to follow whenever you're working on quantitative projects. The first one, and I think that's perhaps the most important, is that you should do no harm. And when you collect data from an individual, you should not turn around and use that data to harm the individual in question. That could end up being ambiguous, right? Imagine a setup where your job is to try to find or identify people who cheat on their taxes. Well, if you collect data from individuals and then you use that data to identify an individual who you think might have cheated on their taxes, and you audit them and they have indeed cheated on their taxes, you could argue that you've actually harmed the individual by using their data. On the other hand, I think most of us would agree that non-compliance at tax time is actually more harmful to society as a whole, right? So you have to sort of balance the pros and the cons. But even within that balance, it is crucial that you spend a fair amount of time making sure that you are not harming the individuals whom you've collected data from. Another element is the idea of informed consent. And that covers a pretty wide breadth of ethical questions, but the key point is that when an individual agrees to the collection and use of their data, they have to have a real understanding of what it is that they're consenting to and the consequences for them and others. And more often than not, we do not have a good understanding of what it is we're consenting to. If you've downloaded an app on the internet, or if you're a Facebook user or a Google user, do you truly understand what Facebook or Google or any of these other companies are telling you that they're going to be doing with your data? There's also the idea that we should try to respect privacy as much as possible. And this is a principle that is held pretty dearly by a number of people, but it is hard to maintain in the age of the internet. There's tons of robots out there that are trawling the net trying to find personal data. Due to some issues related to informed consent, it's quite possible that you've installed apps and that you have, unbeknownst to you, given your agreement to companies selling your data. As a consultant, you don't really want to be part of that type of thing. An aspect which is related to data privacy is the idea that we should be keeping data public. Some data public, all data public, most data public, any data public. If the idea of respecting privacy is important to the society in which you're working, well, obviously not all of the data must be kept public. If you're working in defense, for instance, you could argue that actually making all data public could harm operatives in other countries. But are we supposed to have operatives in other countries? I don't have a clear-cut answer to a question such as this. If you're going to aim for informed consent, you need to give individuals the ability to not consent, to opt out of data collection. When you're downloading an app, very often you have the option of opting out. If you opt out, you cannot download the app. And that's sort of understood that not downloading the app means that you're not consenting to whatever it is that they're telling you they're going to do. But you have to be wary of consent which is tacit, which is to say unspoken but understood by some people, not all, and stated. In essence, if you are going to be using data as part of your quantitative consulting activities, you need to make sure that stated explicit consent was given for use of the data. Now, that doesn't apply to all data sets or to all situations, but there are many instances where it will apply. If we're trying to respect privacy, we might decide that one solution is to anonymize the data, to remove identifying fields from the data set before you do the analysis. And that sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's actually quite difficult to anonymize data properly. I live in a very small village, about 40 kilometers north of the city, on the Quebec side of the river. Even if you remove the name of the individual and their address, well, if your data set contains information about, say, the number of kids, type of car the person is driving, it is going to be fairly easy to identify me from the data. In a big city, that could be more complicated, but you can imagine that there's some other combination of fields that could allow you to be identified from the data, even if the names and the addresses and the email addresses have been stripped from the data set. And there's another principle which we basically think of as being this sacrosanct principle, something that all analysts are taught to do. It's to let the data speak. Now, I've put this in quotation marks because it's actually not easy to let the data speak. You have to do absolutely no cherry picking of the data. You need to spend some time on validating the data, making sure that it measures what it's supposed to be measuring. You need to worry about correlation and causation. You need to worry about the difference between correlation in the data and causation. In many instances, what quantitative analysts can do is to identify the presence of strong correlation or weak correlation between a variety of features in the data set. But correlation is not the same thing as causation, right? Letting the data speak means not letting it say more than it's truly saying. And there are issues of repeatability as well. If somebody was collecting data on their own to try to repeat or replicate your experiment, do they get the same sort of results? Are the results that you're obtaining specific to the sample that you have collected and not of the underlying population? David Brin, the science fiction author, also does a fair amount of consulting on the side, suspects that brings up the idea that perhaps one of the ways in which you could protect privacy is to make everything absolutely transparent. And I'm bringing up this idea here not necessarily because I believe in it or I think he's right, but to highlight the fact that there's a lot of potential solutions or approaches to protecting privacy, and they're not always going to be completely compatible with other notions that you might have. Here the idea, this is called surveillance, so surveillance from underneath, is that if you empower citizens to notice when neighbors infringe on privacy, then you might actually manage to reduce infringement on privacy. If you're in a crowded public space, do you really hear any of the conversations around you? As opposed to being in a quiet coffee shop where there's only one other couple there and they're conversing. There's a good chance you'll be able to hear everything that they're saying, even if it's not your intention to eavesdrop on them. When you come up with your ethical statement, I'd like for you to think about your ability to gauge whether a project or a type of analysis should be good, bad, or ugly. Either from a technical standpoint, because that's a possibility, the data might not have been analyzed properly. And if the conclusions are being released as though the analysis had been conducted properly, then you might end up misleading the stakeholders or the people who will make decisions based on the results. That's a bit of an ethical breach, right? From my perspective, good projects are those that increase knowledge, that help you uncover hidden links, things you didn't really know or understand about the data or the situation prior to embarking on the analysis. Bad projects would be those that, if they're not done properly, they can lead to bad decisions. Ugly projects, well, there's a lot of not very savory applications out there. I'm going to give you an example of an application which I've just heard about recently, which I find to be completely terrifying. So you may be aware that during the pandemic, Amazon has kept a fair number of their warehouses open in order to try to minimize interactions which could lead to potential outbreaks of COVID-19. They've set up a machine learning video software that tracks or follows workers around the warehouses and identifies when they come too close to another worker. In order for this to be doable, you need to be able to track people, to follow them. Now you might say, well, this comes from a good place. We're trying to minimize the risks of spread of a disease. But in order to do so, we have developed a technology that can then be used to follow people. Can you think of ugly ramifications of such a technology?